Good news, everyone! Our first story tonight is actually more of a mixed bag, but there is reason to be optimistic. From NBC News, the Supreme Court on Monday waded into the culture war debate over gender-affirming care for transgender minors by agreeing to resolve challenges to a law in Tennessee that seeks to restrict it. See earlier Transpositions episodes for more on that Tennessee law. The justices will hear a Biden administration appeal of a court ruling that upheld the measure. Oral arguments and a ruling are expected in the court's next term, which starts in October. The case marks the first time that the court, which does have a 6-3 conservative majority, will issue a ruling in the battle over transgender rights for teens. Although there is some cause for concern, considering the rulings coming out of this particular iteration of the Supreme Court, there are several factors to consider here. As put into words by Chase Strangio, a lawyer from the American Civil Liberties Union, who said, quote, "The future of countless transgender youth in this and future generations rests on this court adhering to the facts, the Constitution, and its own modern precedent." And that is important because, A, many of the justices on the court do advocate for constitutional supremacy, particularly over conflicting laws at the state level. B, the facts of the case make it very clear that Tennessee's law, like many other state laws, are blatantly illegal, coming into conflict not only with the Constitution, but several other federal laws. And C, and possibly most important, this case draws directly on other recent Supreme Court decisions, such as Obergefell. So for the Supreme Court to decide in favor of upholding the illegal restrictions, they would have to literally undermine everything they claim to stand for, including the Supreme Court's own power. This is a hotly contested matter, however, as two federal courts have ruled to block bans in both Tennessee and Kentucky to a greater or lesser extent. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the bans in September, with Judge Jeffrey Stutton writing that no one was questioning the existence of gender dysphoria or the distress caused by it, but indicated the question of what treatments should be available to those 17 or under should be left to elected officials, rather than parents or doctors. That seems like an unlikely position for the Supreme Court to adhere to, considering the extreme emphasis on parents' rights in recent years. But before becoming too pessimistic on the matter, one more thing to keep in mind while we wait for the court's next term to open and the case to be heard. It was just last year, with these same justices, that the court threw out a West Virginia law that blocked Becky Pepper Jackson from participating in West Virginia school sports. And finally on this one, it was conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch who wrote the opinion on the 6-3 decision in the Bostock case. He concluded that Title VII, which is a federal law that bars sex discrimination in employment, also protects transgender people. Speaking of Supreme Courts, on the other side of the planet, Japan's Supreme Court recognizes a transgender woman as a parent. From the Japan Times, the Supreme Court on Friday recognized a transgender woman as the father of a child she had with her female partner using sperm frozen prior to her transition. It was the first ever decision by the country's top court on whether to recognize a parent-child relationship in a case in which a biological father had a child after transitioning to be a woman. All four justices affirmed the decision, which means that the child will be guaranteed the right of inheritance from the transgender mother and the right to claim child support from her if that becomes necessary. Presiding Justice Akira Ojima said that not recognizing a parent-child relationship in the case would go against the child's interest. The previous ruling by the Tokyo High Court had denied a father-child relationship. She applied to be recognized as the parent of two of her daughters, but her application was rejected. A lawsuit was then filed seeking such recognition, in which the two daughters were the plaintiffs and she was the defendant. In February 2022, the Tokyo Family Court dismissed the woman's claims on the grounds that her transition meant that she was neither a father nor the birth giver and therefore mother as defined by the Civil Code. While the High Court in August the same year recognized a father-child relationship between the woman and the first daughter, it denied such a relationship for the second daughter because she was born after the transition. This decision effectively sets a precedent for an entire country that transition does not invalidate parentage, which is, after all, a very nice thing to have on the books. Our next story isn't directly about a transgender person, but rather an ally working to make a difference in the lives of transgender people from the Bangor Daily News. In a small office at Northern Light A.R. Gould Hospital in Presque Isle, people are learning new ways of speaking to match their gender identities. Speech-language pathologist Robbie Desjardins leads clients, many of whom are transgender, but not all, on a complex and sometimes emotional journey to retrain their voices. Gender-affirming voice therapy helps people express themselves more authentically, but can also help keep people from misidentifying their gender. Those of you who've been around a while might notice that I've been doing voice training, and while my voice is not yet perfect, we've definitely made some considerable progress. Desjardins' program is a first for Aroostook County and one of just a few in Maine, and his growing client list spans the state. He said in an interview with the Daily News, when people can project outwardly who they are inside, it builds confidence and improves their lives. Quote, "It's less stigmatized to have your voice match your identity. Up here, a lot of it has to do with safety in the community. People still have some very harsh thoughts about the trans community, so it's more than just an identity thing. It's a safety thing, and it's a quality of life thing." The therapy has been around for about 20 years, but not many people practice it in Maine, Desjardins said. He came to A.R. Gould in 2019 and launched the program in 2020. A 2022 study estimates there are 5,900 transgender adults and 1,200 transgender youth in Maine, according to the Maine Center for Economic Policy. Notably, Maine Family Planning of Portland offers transgender health care, but not vocal training, and in fact refers many patients to the Presque Isle program. Desjardins goes on to point out that this kind of therapy is one of practice rather than physical alteration, saying, quote, "We can't change someone's body, but we can change how they use the muscles." There are a number of channels here on YouTube with tips for voice training and exercises that those practicing can use. It's not the same as seeing an actual trained therapist one-on-one, someone who gets to know your capabilities, limitations, and progress and can give you directed tips. But for those who can't make it to a physical practice like this one on Presque Isle, it is a somewhat workable alternative. However, it does take time. As Desjardins says, treatment includes roughly 20 sessions and takes a lot of patience and practice between sessions. To help patients move along, he incorporates games and fun scenarios to make things enjoyable, and even smartphone apps to assist in voice training. But if people aren't willing to put in the work between sessions, they won't be successful. One client interviewed by the Daily News, Kira Dwen Libby, said that the results have been transformative. She works in customer service, dealing with people over the phone, and was nearly always misgendered, so she sought help from the therapy team. She said it took a lot of work, but was well worth the effort. With guidance and the exercises offered to her, it's now rare that someone mistakes her gender, and she credits the program with her success. She said, quote, "He honestly cares about us as individuals and wants to help equip us with the tools we need to accomplish our goals of having our voices sound more authentic to our gender." Desjardins closes by saying, quote, "The most rewarding part is when somebody tells me they've been able to make a phone call and they haven't been misgendered. They've not been ridiculed or given a strange look. I want people to smile and feel good about what they're saying and how they're saying it." Our next story is a bit of a mixed bag. From NPR affiliate KUER, Utah invokes sovereignty to ignore the Biden administration's Title IX transgender protections. With a crowd of protesters outside the Utah House chambers, lawmakers voted on the 19th to go against the Biden administration's expansion of Title IX protections, The new federal rules cover transgender as well as pregnant and other LGBTQ+ students. The administration's efforts to diversify Title IX goes against a handful of laws the Utah legislature has approved in recent years. Most recently, the governor signed a bill that prohibits transgender students from using a bathroom. In the first test of the new Utah Constitutional Sovereignty Act, what a name, the legislature passed, along party lines, 2 resolutions in a special session related to the U.S. Department of Education Title IX extensions that go into effect on August 1st. Utah House Speaker Mike Schultz said, quote, "I want to point out that this was the Biden administration, unelected bureaucrats that put this rule in place. 9 was a great piece of legislation passed in 1972 meant to protect women, and that's what we're upholding in the state of Utah." Speaker Schultz seems completely unaware that the expansion of Title IX protections does in no way diminish the existing protections, and that it is also the direct result of the aforementioned Supreme Court decision by the same Supreme Court. It is not a direct act of the executive branch of the government, but a matter of constitutional law determined by the Supreme Court. HCR 301, the bill sponsored by Republican Representative Kira Birkeland, instructs state agencies to, quote, "comply with Utah laws where there is a conflict with the new regulations adopted under Title IX." In a committee hearing, Birkeland called the resolution simple in that it clears up any confusion government entities may have on which law they should follow. She said, quote, "it just compels and tells government entities to follow state law by ignoring federal law," which raises an interesting conundrum if those agencies then choose to ignore state law and follow the federal law the same way the state is trying to ignore the federal law. After all, if it's legitimate for the state to ignore a higher-ranking law, it's certainly legitimate for lower-ranking agencies to ignore the middle-ranking lawmakers. But it gets worse for Utah lawmakers. On the Senate floor, there was concern that the resolution violates the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which states federal law trumps state law in a conflict, a law that has been upheld every single time it has been challenged since 1789. Republican Senator Kurt Bramble argued that the 10th Amendment outweighs and grants states the power to disregard the federal government. It should be noted that this same argument was used in defense of the secession of the Confederate States, and it didn't work out well for them. Democratic Senator Nate Blauen said, quote, "It seems to me like we are opening ourselves up to some really potentially expensive lawsuits or losses of funding where we could just be letting the process play out as it has for centuries in this country." The other bill, HJR 301, sponsored by Republican Representative Neil Walter, claims the Title IX expansion constitutes an overreach of federal authority that violates Utah's rights and interests to discriminate against and harm the health, safety, and welfare of Utah residents. It should be noted that's not the precise wording of the bill, but it is both the intention and the effect behind it. Walter said that the Title IX provisions violate HB 11, a law currently on hold by the courts that restricts transgender athletes from participating in girls' and women's sports. In much the same way, the Obergefell decision by the U.S. Supreme Court overrode Utah's laws prohibiting marriage between persons of the same sex, because that's how federal laws work. He added it also conflicts with HB 257, the infamous bathroom bill that led to the tip line, which generated such interesting results as reported on in a previous episode of TheTransPositions. Walter notes that the new Title IX provisions state that it prohibits discrimination against any person based on their seeking, obtaining, or having experienced termination of pregnancy, and therefore should be opposed? Democratic Representative Sahara Hayes, the only openly LGBTQ+ lawmaker, expressed concerns about students not feeling safe in schools and their commitments to the U.S. Department of Education around their experiences with harassment that, quote, leave students in constant fear, cause social anxiety and stress disorders, and too frequently lead to self-harm. She went on to say, aren't these kids just as worthy of health, safety, and well-being? These are the kids that the state of Utah is trying to fight against right now. This Supreme Court ruling is an attempt to protect these kids from discrimination. That is a very real threat to their lives. And we might not know them, we might not understand them, but they are just as worthy of this protection as any other citizen. On the Senate floor, Senator Scott Sandel, the architect of the Utah Constitutional Sovereignty Act, said he's aware of all these things, but he believes the cause of being able to discriminate against a particular group of people is a noble cause that could set precedent for the whole rest of the country, opening up the doors to allow discrimination against every minority who currently enjoys federal protection. Quote, we know that we're breaking some original ground here. No other state in the nation that we know of has really tried this approach, but I believe it's a sound approach, and I believe it's one that we can use very judiciously. And in this case, we have used it in a very judicious manner. We will direct, upon passage of these two resolutions, our state agencies to comply with state law until, and at some future time, the courts would rule otherwise. Because that is, after all, the Republican tactic. Pass laws knowing they're illegal, but getting to enforce them until the courts intervene. If only there was some federal regulation that protected citizens against intentional malfeasance on the part of their elected representatives. Republican Senator Daniel Thatcher, the sole no vote from the GOP, cited concerns about funding, noting that Utah receives $696 million from the federal government for nutrition programs, Title I, for career and technical education, and especially for special education programs. He said, quote, so while I do believe we have the authority to do this, and while I do believe that they, the federal government, do not have constitutional authority to enact laws that affect all 50 states, I do believe that the lack of constitutional leverage will compel them to threaten our funding. He said, entitledly. Senate President Stuart Adams noted that there are risks for enforcing these new laws, not just to the citizenry, but to Utah's state budget, which of course matters so much more than the lives of citizens. But he said, quote, we actually think we're on solid ground. We actually think the courts will support us. And he added that the state has managed its finances extremely well. If funding is revoked, quote, we've got lots of money that we can put in reserve, and we'll deal with that issue as it comes. Now, while this seems like a whole lot of downside, the silver lining is that the law is almost definitely going to fail any legal challenge. But more importantly, even in extremely red Utah, the heart of Mormon territory, where there is a motivated political interest with hundreds of billions of dollars behind it to oppress and repress LGBTQ plus groups, people are still mobilizing against this kind of nonsense. And this effort is the very best the state regressives could manage. As the protester sign reads, Utah lawmakers, your obsession with kids' genitals is concerning. Finally, our last story for today, a transgender wrestling superstar prepares to make her return to the ring. From Inside the Ropes, Gabbi Tuft is best known to wrestling fans as former WWE superstar Tyler Rex, who performed with the sports entertainment giant between 2008 and 2012. In February 2021, Gabbi Tuft publicly came out as a transgender woman. 2 weeks after her announcement, she opened up to Renee Paquette about the freeing experience of coming out, saying she felt like her, quote, prison sentence was over. And that is very much a relatable sentiment. In recent weeks, Tuft has been posting teases on her social media that, quote, mother is coming. And on June 23rd, she revealed that she'll be returning to in-ring competition for the first time in nearly a decade when she competes at West Coast Pro Wrestling on June 25th. The match is set to air at a yet-to-be-determined date on YouTube, Triller TV, and 125 TV stations nationwide. Speaking in an interview with the Orlando Sentinel, Tuft admitted that not everyone has been understanding about her transition. However, the star insists she's not bothered by her doubters, as the whole world will be watching her return. Quote, "You can't please everyone. Half the world will look at this character, a trans woman, and wonder why I'm back. They'll hate me. The other half will understand and absolutely love me. That's okay, because they'll all be watching." Gabbi originally left the world of wrestling after the birth of her daughter, who is now 13 years old. She says now is a great time to return and be her authentic self in the public eye. She said, quote, "I walked away to be with my family with so much in front of me. Now that my daughter is almost 13, I travel all the time for business anyway, and she's okay with it. So it's time. This is my true self, me as authentic as I could be, knowing who I am, and no one can control me. This is 100% my creation, and I'm 100% confident that I can finish the career I started. I, for one, will be paying very close attention to how this goes and how the world reacts." And now I'll sign off with something new. As many of you know, TheTransPositions does have its own Discord, and it's now open to the public. In addition to scientific papers, resources for transgender people, and ways to keep up with the anchors and connect with the community, there is also a memes channel. So I've decided to try out adding a meme of the week to the end of Good News. This one was posted by our own Bumblebee, and the irony is quite delicious. For TheTransPositions, I've been Ember Belrad.